Welcome back to another episode of Re-Correlated Podcast. I am back here. My name is Natalie. I am back here with Mac Wertenberger, and we are very excited to introduce our very special guest this week, Amanda Molina. She is corporate counsel at Microsoft, advising various clients within the technical infrastructure on legal matters relating to data privacies, AI, data regulations. She's also, a JAG attorney and assistant JAG attorney in the Air Force. And actually even your unit seems to focus on cyber law as well. And you've spent time on Capitol Hill kind of legislating and arguing for, technical law and technical legislation surrounding AI and AI strategy. So Amanda, if you'd like to go in a little bit more into your details of your experience, go right ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here with Mac and Natalie and getting to speak to your listeners as well. So my actual experience goes all the way back to when I was an intern, when I was a law student. So I was interning for the White House when the OPM hack happened, and my my actual application, my security application, was delayed because that's when the hack was discovered. And I was so frustrated that I had to write that entire thing by hand and submit it all by hand that I just kept delving and asking questions to White House staff to the point where they started questioning me. And I was just trying to understand why it happened and what their take on it was, and to the degree that they were able to divulge, certain information about it and where vulnerabilities were. I was like, okay, this is a policy even at the within our office in the White House that we can start. I was in the Office of Drug Control Policy specifically. So this is something that we can start implementing. So while I was more focused on drug control policy at the time, I already was getting interested in how data privacy and security already worked while I was working interning at the White House. So fast forward to today, after having kind of this dual government service work where I've worked on the Hill for several years, advising in different areas of legislation to the entire, the House of Representatives in a nonpartisan role, to now being in big tech, as you mentioned, corporate counsel at Microsoft, which has been one of the leading AI companies in the world right now. And it's been a really great pleasure to be there during that time, as well as a JAG officer, where I see a lot of different operations in the warfare space, and how we're not only implementing cybersecurity law and policy, but also AI and how that plays a role in what we're doing. I'm actually, I don't know if you saw it recently, I'm going to be attending Oxford for an AI executive diploma as well in London. So I start that in January, but don't worry, I'm still going to stay at Microsoft and continue.
Wow, what an incredible opportunity. That sounds wild.
Yeah, I am very excited about this topic because I'm just over here collecting all the legal cybersecurity baddies, in the industry, and getting them to come on the podcast and talk. So I'm very, very excited. Hot takes, if we want to start off with our hot takes, kind of go around the room, and then we can pick which one we want to dive into first. Mandy, go right ahead.
Sure. I'll just say hot takes on where I see trends going with respect to cybersecurity and AI. And I know it was part of our description, but quantum computing is a big topic and where we're going and where the risks are and what we're doing as far as developing our defense strategy with respect to China, Russia, Iran, and just in general, ensuring that we have our defense posture. So as far as where global trends are going, I think we need to consider those different, China's rise right now and their ambition, Russia as a global trend, with them kind of engaging this retrenchment, and the war in Ukraine obviously is a very big topic at the moment, as well as just right now what's going on in the United States and polarization. So we have all these different geopolitical trends, but in the context of quantum, I think that there's a lot of implications that I'll delve a little bit more into throughout our discussion. But quantum has so many different implications, not just with quantum computers, but as far as cryptography and even how our adversaries are building just data analysis on every one of our citizens in those regards. So I guess my hot take is this: quantum is one of the bigger trends, and we need to consider it in those geopolitical tensions.
Matt, go ahead.
I was going to say, I'm going to jump in. That is awesome. I think, Mandy, you're on exactly the right track. I think we're in this incredible time as a country. Before we came on air, I was talking about the challenges facing our federal agencies, both defense and civilian. And we are in this state of flux. Obviously, this week has been a state of flux. We know we've got a new administration coming in, an administration that, could have a completely different set of policies when it comes to cybersecurity in the next phase. The world has changed a lot since the last time Trump was our president, and I think it's going to be a lot of really rapid catch up. I am hopeful that a lot of the executive orders that we've seen come through to mandate things like responsible AI usage and zero trust security are going to continue, because we are under constant attack from well-funded, well-resourced, less influx nation states and organizations that absolutely are trying to infiltrate defense, private, and civilian sectors all across our country. That applies to AI and ML for sure, because it is rapidly increasing the speed at which our adversaries are able to build attacks and then pivot when those attacks are stopped and build new attacks. And then, of course, quantum, you're absolutely right, is going to change everything. I spend a lot of time talking to agencies about cryptographic agility and what that means. And we're kind of operating in this world of, okay, we don't have quantum computing yet, but when it gets here, a lot of the stuff you're doing is obsolete. Like, you might as well just put all those social security numbers out on the open web. We've got a lot of really bombastic challenges facing our country right now, and we've got a lot of flux happening. So I'm really interested to see how, in light of a ever accelerating movement that's fueled by artificial intelligence and machine learning, and then this massive push to see who's going to get to the moon first, and the moon being quantum, I think as a country, we are going to have to pivot quickly here in January and get right back on track, or we're at real risk of falling victim to some of these onslaughts that are definitely happening right now in real time. Natalie?
Yeah, so
that's me.
Now, my hot take would be, we've talked about nationally what we're going to have to do to kind of keep up. But like, what about on the worldwide scale? How are we going to keep up with like the legislation that protects like what happens during a time of war, especially with cyber warfare, because that's something that's always like kind of intrigued me a little bit, especially pertaining to rules of engagement with civilians hosting a lot of the infrastructure that we utilize. So that would be my hot take. Amanda, you were talking about trends in quantum computing and everything when we did our hot take. So if you want to go into quantum a little bit, give us a basic rundown, because I think a lot of people think like, oh, quantum computing, but then like they just like use that as a term that they're just throwing out there because it sounds good. So like, tell us, what is it? What is it actually?
That's completely fair. So I think quantum computing, I'd say, is a little bit too specific. I'd rather take a step back and say quantum technology, because there's also quantum communication or quantum networks that aren't just, they're related, but I'd say they're even a little bit different from what we consider quantum computer. So since you're both technical, I'll go a little bit more than I would with my legal person. But so I'll say, like, just give a brief description. So typical computers, as you both know, operate on bits. So like transistors can, like a light switch, turn on and off. And so we're in that constant zeros and ones states. Quantum computers or quantum technology, on the other hand, uses qubits or quantum bits. And these qubits can be in multiple states. And they don't, I don't know how much you've gotten. I'm not big on quantum physics. I do like to read for fun on it. But what's really fascinating is with like quantum states, there's these different like parallelism within quantum that don't apply to traditional computing. So where we'd see like the typical ones and zeros, what you'd think like, oh, at the quantum level is just this tiny level of our microscopic cosm of the way we behave, completely different. Quantum theory and quantum science, like physics, actually shows us that it behaves completely different. So it's not just zeros and ones, it's zeros, ones, both states, anything in between. And so with that, we're able to act a lot more quickly with quantum computers or with like different quantum technology. But at the same time, because we're operating in qubits, it's using atoms. So or atoms as well as subatomic particles. So because we're operating at the subatomic level, the technical and practical challenges are always there. So what's most challenging to the quantum space is something considered like noise. So noise can be anything from just like temperature variations. If there's like a giant truck rolling by and it like varies the computer moves a little bit. So with quantum, we're seeing a lot of different kind of capabilities arise, but at the same time, that noise keeps us from being able to increase the qubits, which would theoretically increase our capability. So quantum in general is this, I lost you, considered to be a new phase within science. So it's not it's not necessarily new, but our advancements have really started to move a lot in the last 10 years. So when I'm speaking about quantum, I'm not just talking about where we are, I'm also talking about where we theoretically can be in the next 5 to 10 years. And so in the quantum space, the movement towards a lot of the capabilities of this dual use technology really go back to just those practicalities that I'm talking about and the difficulties with the quantum computer. And then, as you mentioned, Natalie, that on the world stage, what having developed nations have access to these quantum computers and these quantum defense capabilities and defense and offense capabilities will do in compared to those who don't have access to that as well. So just things to consider. Do you have questions for me? I feel like I went a little bit in depth into those nuances.
So do you think that like quantum computing, that like, you know how like we as a nation track what nations have nuclear powers or nuclear capabilities? Do you ever foresee there being a future, or do you think that it already is happening, where we are actually able to track which countries have quantum computing capabilities or quantum capabilities?
The way we refer to quantum capabilities in the military, similar to the way we spoke a little bit about how we prepare for certain technologies. We're like, act like Russia and China already have it. That's essentially how we think about quantum. Russia and China in particular, likely already has it. But even back in 2017, remember I referred to different quantum technologies. Back in 2017, China made huge strides in quantum communication, where they were able to teleport a photon under record distances. I believe it was from Tibet to a satellite in orbit around 800 miles, a little over that. I don't know the exact amount. So at the time, it was a huge deal. So even in that regard, when we're looking at quantum communication, the first thing I remember when I read that article back in 2017 was, if you're an intelligence professional, how do you decrypt that? Because it's instant. And data in transit is where we typically see a lot of the vulnerabilities happen, as you both are aware. So speaking about quantum communication, when you're talking about those capabilities, so that's where you see differences. So as far as like quantum computers, I think the US is ahead because we have a lot of partnerships with private entities like Microsoft, IBM, Google, whereas China has been a little bit more discreet in where they are. So we're not particularly sure. We think we're ahead on quantum computing. They do share some information. And I think in the research space, it tends to be a lot less adversarial overtly. It's a little bit more collegial in how we communicate. But there's always that kind of tension where, we want to be the leaders. And so do they. As you mentioned, there's essentially a quantum arms race, or quantum race. I won't say arms.
Yeah. Matt, go ahead. I don't mean to take up all the time.
No. I love that. And I think, especially when we're looking at like some of these states, and you use China as an example, and I think they have been exceptional in terms of I think just how they've harnessed, from a cybersecurity perspective, how they've harnessed some of their like grassroots hackers, are now entering in state-run, like essentially black hat competitions. And they're gleaning a lot of their new techniques and technologies directly from these kind of open sourced hacker competitions. I would have to believe that they're doing, that a lot of our adversaries, partners, I mean, it's tough. Like it's the same side of, or it's a different side of the same coin. I have to believe that there's a lot of that grassroots technology momentum happening. I had a question about, from a legal standpoint, I think we've established all the really great reasons why quantum is going to be a game changer. It's going to be a paradigm shift, both in terms of how we secure things, how we fight wars, how we build computers, all of it. We saw this maybe on a slightly smaller scale kind of shift happen when AI kind of hit. I mean, I know AI has been around for a long time, but the advent of every single good and product on the internet having a ChatGPT wrapper associated with it. So suddenly, powered by AI, your dishwasher powered by AI. As you're thinking from a legal perspective with Microsoft, are you already planning for trying to kind of have those legal protections in place for when quantum hits? Because it feels like AI kind of took us by surprise, and it was kind of the Wild West there for a little bit. If we're looking at, if that was a flood, are we ready for the quantum tidal wave, and how to secure that transition space? As you're talking about, what nations are going to have quantum capabilities, what nations aren't, what industry is going to have quantum capabilities, what industry isn't. How do you navigate that, both from a geopolitical global standpoint and also an industry standpoint?
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you for the reminder. I don't speak on behalf of Microsoft or the United States government.
Of course.
When you had mentioned
Disclaimer.
Since we were chatting beforehand, I forgot to mention it early on. But yes, this applies to the whole conversation. So with respect to what Microsoft, all big tech companies are doing, and I think the United States government in particular is kind of looking at this as well, is establishing guidance. It's more so on a voluntary basis at the moment, establishing these guardrails to help responsible AI and ethics be developed, especially in light of the capabilities, not just quantum, but in general of where they are. I know that exactly like you mentioned, I mean, John McCarthy, Turing, Minsky, they developed the idea, the term AI back in the 1950s. And I don't even know if they really envisioned where we're going to be today and where we're likely going to be in the next 10, 20 years, which, is kind of up for grabs. And so with respect to the law tends to move slow, especially in the United States. We have this very sectoral. So typically standards are kind of self-regulating, like industries will self-regulate. What I've seen with AI, not just at Microsoft, and is this partnership with big companies, international cooperation, as well as with the administration, really take a proactive approach, which made me feel a lot better. Because when you really delve deep into the technology in general, the use cases and the dual use cases, I mean, you could ask an AI chatbot to develop a biochemical weapon early on, or a malicious code that could break into the past. I'm not saying it could do that, but those kind of questions would come through early on, and these guardrails had to be established. And to the degree that the law actually required these companies to establish these guardrails, it wasn't really there. But now we have these attribution questions and negligence questions. Like, if this is happening, if that they could do this, why didn't you stop it? And so my fear is that there's going to be kind of this AI/quantum proverbial bomb. Sorry, I'm hesitating. Something really bad happens where people start taking it a lot more seriously. But luckily, I don't think that's happening. They're taking it seriously now. Government, regulators are taking it seriously. Our industry's taking it seriously. And it's not because it touches so many sectors. There's a lot more voluntary rules being implemented rather than specific. I know that the Biden administration just came out in October with an AI memoranda that kind of laid out the administration's ideas for where AI is going to go. NIST is establishing different protocols for safety. So there has been a lot of movement, but for the most part, there's not that much specific regulation. There's the EU AI Act, but that's not going to be enforced until next year. So we're preparing already for that. And then to more specifically answer your question about like quantum, not just cryptography, but preparing for where regulation is, it's kind of understanding where high risk and prohibited use cases are, and even within our marketplace, understanding how we can identify that and ensure that it gets either worked out or taken off, or that our partners are able to identify those prohibited risks or high risk uses of the technology.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you.
Yep.
Natalie, I'm sure with your legal background, you've got some thoughts on this too.
Yeah, like, well, I was just gonna go into like, do you think that, because I have a legal background, but I came back and worked in like technical field in security for a while, and then I went to GRC. So like, do you think we're going to see a lot more on the compliance side with like compliance requirements becoming more strict over the next few years, like revisions of like NIST 853, or subsequent? I know you said a little bit about like NIST is doing some work on creating some guardrails there as well, but that are very specific to like AI and machine learning. And then do you think that, again, in the future, we could see that happening again with quantum?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've seen a push on the Fed side with the cybersecurity maturity model and other specific regulations that are addressing like a post-quantum cryptographic like protection system. Essentially, we're putting these protocols or laws in place to ensure that if our adversaries had this technology, we want to make sure that they can't, get through our defenses, take our especially top secret information. So that's already on the Fed side. They're already moving to use that technology or to prepare for the use of that technology. As far as just laws in general and where we're seeing it in the United States, I think it's more broken down in terms of like different sectors, as I mentioned, like industry. So recently, actually, this came up on my like recent military. Sometimes just AI in general can be used both by the dual use, but this was completely in a civilian capacity. There was a young man, was a boy actually, that was using an AI tool to create a deep fake of a classmate for a pornographic image, and this child was charged with distribution of child pornography. And so like, that's a really dark case, but I mention it, and I don't shy away from it, because when people think about all the different uses, there's amazing. One of the things I love about AI is that it has amazing capabilities for us, not just to prepare for warfare, but it can really help us be more precise in how we engage in warfare, more precise in who we target, more precise in who we're conducting surveillance, reconnaissance on. And protecting ourselves from those things. But on the commercial side, it does, similar sense that we are able to be more specific in how we operate. We're able to, honestly, like the use cases are endless and how the technology can be used. But while they're endless on the positive side and for good, it can also be used for bad. And so we really want to try to protect people. And so a lot of the regulation that you're seeing is focused on ensuring that AI is very human-centric and that human in the loop. Back when I was in, again, law school days, I remember a couple members from the CIA and different people, because our professors were actually like working at the CIA. But a couple people were debating, not just here in the US, but at the United Nations, about the use of lethal autonomous weapon systems. And so I remember the headlines. They were like, Terminator, you have these lethal autonomous weapon systems. So when you have these capabilities, and this human in the loop is how we kind of landed as saying, like, we need to ensure, you talked about the rules of engagement earlier today. We need to ensure that when we're using these technologies and we're using, let's say, lethal autonomous weapons, that weapon or that robot is not disproportionately like targeting civilians, that it's not, that it's based on necessity. And so do I believe that a robot or AI will able to eventually just make that completely autonomous decision? Probably. But will it still have human bias? Will it still have human ethical considerations that it's been programmed by a person? It's been trained by a person. Even the machine learning has its own, algorithmic bias that tends to come up. So as we consider that, it should always have a human at each point, I believe, or human in the loop is the question.
Yeah, I feel like there's got to be an approval, especially if you're looking at like autonomous weapon systems like that, like a drone, like an unmanned drone strike or something like that. Like you definitely have got to have somebody there to say, yes, we actually do want to do this, because there's so many just different catastrophes that could happen just by degree being off, just the degree and the calculation being slightly off.
Absolutely. We were talking a little bit earlier about just in general, like preparation for like quantum. And I think aside from just quantum, one of the things we're seeing as well, and where I think with the Trump administration, we'll see warfare kind of increase in the defense capacity, not like, I hope not the offense capacity, but is space itself. So there's been a proliferation of satellites in the last 10 years on the commercial space and the use of satellites. And Russia in particular has demonstrated that it has the capabilities to target civilian satellites if it wanted to. I think it was a couple of years ago, it shot down its own satellite. Just saying that it was like an old satellite it was getting rid of, but it was definitely a show of force to the United States and saying, we have this capability. So I think in the space, and we talked a little bit about nuclear as well, that threat detection, and especially when we get quantum, because that's one of the benefits of quantum technology is its ability to engage in pattern recognition. And so you'd have to have the systems connected, of course, and the networks configured, but being able to detect when your adversary might engage in something like that, or to move, moving satellites is very difficult. Even a lot of private sector companies are also in that space, but there's very little protections outside of what we already have. And there's also very little legal protections aside from international humanitarian law and what already exists as far as the law of war is concerned. So when it comes to space, I think there needs to be a little bit more regulation in what we do in space, because there's been such a large commercial influx of commercial assets being launched into space. And I know that I've seen a couple of like hotel developments, like an orbiting hotel. I don't know if you've seen that, which could present international issues, as far not just with targeting, but if there's there needs to be cooperation if there's an error. We recently saw an issue with astronauts being stuck out on in space on these orbiting the Earth, and we need to make sure that there's some kind of international cooperation that goes on if that happens, especially if it's owned by a particular country or in that regard. I know I went into a bunch of different topics, so if there's one that particularly interested you.
Go ahead, Mac.
So I'm gonna take us back. I want to get into the space stuff because I do think the Star Trek nerd in me is just wanting to say the final frontier so often. But I want to go back quickly before we leave the AI and the power of AI conversation, because both of you brought up something that I think is really pertinent, which is bias. And we are increasingly integrating AI into all kinds of capabilities from an industry perspective, from a civilian perspective, but also from a defense and an offensive warfighting perspective. But these language models and artificial intelligences are trained by humans, and humans have bias. And we've seen some of the challenges that come into play when you're overly reliant on artificial intelligence, and maybe that our artificial intelligence is racist, like maybe it's sexist, maybe, if you look at a cross section of the people that are programming these, if that is not reflective of the use case that it's being deployed in, there's real challenges. We I think are already starting to look at AI as this kind of essential semi-omniscient thing that we trust. I think our global trust in artificial intelligence and trust, comes before reliance on artificial intelligence, is accelerating at an incredibly rapid rate. And we don't have a lot of legal protections in place to ensure that these intelligence models and language models don't have inherent bias, even inadvertently baked in. So Natalie, when you start to talk about like the 1 degree off, the kind of those super tight margins when we're looking at things like warfighting capabilities or, crime prevention, things like that. If we take it out of a global international work perspective and look at something more local, I mean, there's lots of cases where AI has disproportionately identified people that are not white as perpetrators of crimes when they aren't. How should we be thinking about, if we are going to be reliant on this type of technology, and it certainly appears that that's the direction that both industry and federal are moving, how do we ensure that what we're building isn't, is better than human bias? Because that's the real potential. I'm trying to look at this from a really positive perspective. If we can take some of this incredibly granular data analysis and allow these machine learning models to give us better, cleaner, faster data, it could actually remove some of the challenges that bias creates. But if they are also biased, we run into some real ethical issues. Thoughts on that before we move into space? Because then I definitely want to go to space for sure.
Yeah, no, I love this question because it's really near and dear to me. The idea or concept of ensuring that these are kind of like addressing the ethical and bias just in general in the technology. So to your specific question on whether or not we can eliminate bias, I don't believe we can. And the reason I say that is because, like you said, we created it and we're flawed. And so the systems will be flawed, but there's ways that we can mitigate for that. And so in the ethics and AI and responsible AI principles that a lot of companies are adopting, I know that Microsoft has, the EU just had like a big meeting and essentially had these like voluntary adoption of certain, I'll say, doctrines on responsible AI and its use. A lot of the big tech companies have adopted it just voluntarily, but I will say that when it comes to AI, I've had questions where people say, why does this matter? And it hurts my heart because I'm like, not only does this matter for people and minorities that are being affected by it, but it matters to your product's bottom line. And so it matters to your company's reputation. And one thing that I think is great about Microsoft and a lot of the other big tech companies is they focus on trust in the product. So if people can't trust the outcome of what this, whether it's on this data privacy side or on just the product itself, that it's working the way it should be working, then you're going to have a lot of issues in the long term. And the payout with regulators is going to definitely harm you more. So when I speak to business leaders, I try to speak in those terms, that it's going to hurt your bottom line if you don't pay attention to this. And that it doesn't just affect, it's not just important for minorities, it's important for everybody, because your product should be fair and applicable and transparent in how it's applied. So there's a lot of cases that have come up, and I can just give you a few of the more prominent examples. I think you already mentioned one. I won't say specific names of the cases because it's already, I'm sure they've had enough harm to their name. But at the same time too, like you were saying, this reliance on the technology. So one particular company, especially throughout COVID, the AI wasn't trained on darker skin tones, so it was giving wrong diagnosis to patients with darker skin tones and skin cancer. And that's just one example. And especially with minorities, I don't think it's insidious from the engineers I've talked to. It just honestly is having a lack of diversity at all aspects, whether or not you're training the models, you're designing the algorithms, implementing deployment. You need diversity throughout. And I do think that in the United States, we do have this kind of concentration of engineers in certain sectors. I mean, especially after COVID, we have people from all over now, and it's a worldwide, there's people from all over, but we definitely need a little bit more diversity in our engineering pool, in our just development and deployment, all the way through from ideation through implementation. So absolutely, I can keep giving examples on just ethical issues I've seen, but I'll give one on more the military side. Actually, this one I just heard a podcast about. Actually, this is not military, so it's law enforcement. There's a company that I read about recently, and my legal red flags came up, and they said they were researching the capabilities of implanting the memories of victims into prisoners' minds.
Oh, my. Oh, no.
Yeah.
Oh, gosh.
Yeah. And I don't know if it would be optional or what the policy would be behind that, but it seemed very Minority Report-esque in its approach. And those types of questions come up fairly frequently. And like I said, the possibilities are really endless with this technology. I know that I had listened to I'm just AI podcasting all the time, apparently. I mostly listen to them, but there's one that I heard where after the security issues with the Taylor Swift concert happened, or one of her concerts, this company, the CEO was on this podcast, and he said, everyone who buys a ticket, I'm going to make them say the names of everyone they're like giving tickets that they buy multiple tickets to. And then they're just going to like essentially scan the data of every single person and assign a risk number or risk score to each individual person, and then only give you body checks or certain security protocols based on your risk score. You can see how there's already red flags going up in my like data privacy concerns. We have criminal justice concerns. Just applicability in general. But I really found it fascinating that this person on the podcast was completely ignoring any of those red flags. He was very excited about it, and I think as a lawyer, I try to not hinder the ideas, but I also have to be the voice in the room. That's kind of the voice of reason. And I'm like, whoa, just because we can doesn't mean we should. And with AI, the just because we can has vastly increased. And like I said, you can keep going. I mean, you can create so many different things. And with quantum, for example, the main thing when Microsoft launched our quantum division and was explaining one of the things we could do is they gave this example. They're like, it doesn't operate like a traditional computer, but they were like, let's say you want to develop a military material for a company, let's say SpaceX or something like that. They're not one of our clients, so I think it's fine. I want to know if there's a metal alloy that can withstand 1,000,000 degrees, of heat, Fahrenheit. Calculate that. What types of different mixtures of metal would or different materials would we need to create something that can withstand this? So again, there's different use cases that we can give examples of, and while we're talking about ethics, I think it's also important to talk about those factors. Now we have countries and places that have access to this level of technology and can really start operating in space or start building, cryptographic, safety protocol, or I keep saying protocol, safety, just tools that help protect them from any type of attack. But what if you're just a small business in, Taiwan or this company? Like, how we engage in those and sharing those capabilities, that's a question we haven't really started to delve into just yet. And I think until the technology gets there, we're not going to really have those questions yet. But I think it's something to consider, because sharing assets and resources with our allies is also a question that's going to come up. And I think with the recent wars that we're seeing in Ukraine and in the Middle East, that question of how much the U.S. should share its information, should share its military weapon systems or weapons, its technology, are questions that are coming up more frequently now in the policy space.
And who's responsible for securing that data? At that point, is it Ukraine? Like, if we gave Ukraine like some information to help them out or something, are they responsible for securing that data? And what happens if they don't? Because that's always something that's like very always in my mind. Mac, you look like you were going to say something else.
No. This is great. I think that, Amanda, you make great points about that. That's been in the policy space, and I think that we're going to see a big shift in the way that policy is approached as we get into this next administration. Yeah, it's going to be wild.
I know Iran, I think, had hacked. You can correct me if I'm wrong. The Trump campaign.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm wondering if there's going to be a little bit more of a shift away from China and Russia and closer towards addressing Iran, because we really have cybercom as more of a defensive posture in how we address cyber incidences, not cyber attacks.
But that is the interesting feature of quantum, right? Is I think we are definitely from a federal cyberspace, we are in a defense posture, and something that's pretty exciting coming out of the DoD is they've had a huge push recently for federal industry partnerships, and that I think of Microsoft obviously is an industry leader that works really closely in the government space. But the DoD, is one of the most like kind of closed off agencies, is saying like, hey, bring in industry. Like, we want to work with everyone because we've got to catch up. Everyone, this is accelerating so quickly. If you've got the products, let's work together. But I do think about like, yeah, it's an interesting space to see. When quantum comes, are we going to see a shift from just trying to catch up and play defense to suddenly that can be done much more quickly and much more effectively? And when do we see those priorities shift to truly offensive? Not, I think offensive cyber attacks have been nation state funded groups. It's been hackers, mostly, the stuff that you read about, they're targeting the Trump campaign, or they're, targeting hospital groups, but they're less, they're more going in and trying to get data. They're trying to release data. What happens when they can just turn stuff off? And when we can do it too? What happens when quantum unlocks a truly offensive capability from a cyber standpoint? It gives you pause, for sure.
I'll let Natalie ask her question before. I was going to go into Stuxnet, but
oh, no. Let's go there. Let's do that.
Stuxnet's great. Let's talk about Stuxnet.
I bring up Stuxnet because from a cybersecurity perspective, we saw more of kind of this surveillance reconnaissance use of like cyber attacks. Even the OPM, I mean, they were in our systems for a long time before they were discovered, and their goal is still unclear, at least to the public, of what they were doing, aside from just gathering information. So there's more of this information gathering process, but with Stuxnet you saw more of this kinetic capability, that you could use cyber for this offensive type of approach. And so it kind of opened the door. So when you're asking, like, should we take an offensive, there's a lot of legal implications with respect to the rules of engagement and whether or not we can, we haven't, I think since World War II, we haven't had an official declaration of war. And one of the trends that I actually had written down earlier today when I was thinking about what we're seeing in the United States is gridlock, and that goes towards like a lack of leadership. We do have leadership in AI and trying to ensure that we're the leaders, but as far as getting legislation passed and things outside of this partisan tension and gridlock, it's a lot harder to move with that space. So we're seeing more military movement in the space, and just a lot of executive functions on this topic rather than any legislation being passed. So I mention it because if we're going to if we're going to have that discussion of like offensive, there is the legal implications on whether or not we can engage in offensive without a declaration of war. I did use the term incident instead of attack. And in the legal community and in the military, there's a very specific reason I said incident instead of attack. And it's because when we say cyber attack, it triggers those like international humanitarian law and those laws of war rather than incident, which is what's typically used to describe these like essentially attacks. But it's just not something we use. And that's why it's my personal opinion, not the opinion of the military.
No, even in SOC, when I worked in SOC, we called them incidents. And I was very, very anal about making sure we're not calling them cyber attacks. They're incidents until, you always assume you're being attacked, but at the same time, like it's an incident.
Offensive interactions.
Yeah. And I mean, even with like our dogfights aren't really a common thing among like fighter jets anymore. I mean, it does happen. But even with that, I've heard discussions at the military level on whether or not that human in the loop should be there when we're quickly engaging in I'll say aerial maneuvers. Having a computer system that can act without the human saying, yeah, go ahead and act, and it just acts automatically, saves you time. And in not just the cybersecurity space, where time is a huge asset, as you both are aware, but in the military space, time is also that huge asset. So with respect to, I know I'm kind of channeling back when I said, oh, you should have a human in the loop. There are some instances where a human in the loop, I think when it comes to defensive capabilities, doesn't make sense. And when we're engaged in that defensive, like just letting the system protect it, and then we kind of move, whether or not you're talking about, threat detection and, probability calculations. I mean, obviously when you're analyzing like where someone's going to go in their next attack, it really helps to let the AI operate independently. And then when you're ready to act in a more offensive capability, then you can be more in the loop. But from a defensive perspective, I think, having a human out of the loop actually helps. I gave the aerial example because I think it makes more sense in that sense. But as you know, from a cybersecurity perspective, it seems to make sense as well. And correct me to let the machine kind of.
That's the beauty of a Steve and a SOAR, Put the human in audit mode for sure. Sorry, Natalie, you were about to say something.
Oh, no, because like when you brought up the aerial, for me, the cyber aspect of it makes much more sense than like with like the aerial aspect, because the first thing I think of is like 9/11. Like, what if we would have had fighter pilots that were able to shoot those jets down before they ever hit Twin Towers? But that would require not having a human in the loop. And how many other human lives could have been lost, or, debatably, they were still lost at the point when they hit the tower, right? But like how many implications would that cause if, they were just a little bit off in their calculations or something?
Of course. With respect to distinction, that would be a huge question. Can a machine discern? I think it can. But even with like in the Middle East, we saw this a lot with terrorist actors. They will specifically use our own laws against us by hiding behind schools or hospitals or places where they know that that they're a little bit more protected under our own laws, because we have to consider that as well. And I know that we're seeing that as well in other scenarios in the war apparatus, especially in Ukraine, for example, where they're targeting civilian sites. But can a computer, I guess the question there is like, can a computer distinguish? And even if it could distinguish based on the target, is it a high value target? Would a computer be able to make that decision? Would an AI machine be able to determine? Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's a great point.
So we've kind of been dancing around a little bit this whole episode, but like, let's get into cyber war, because I'm really excited about this. Actually, before the podcast, we were talking about UWIC, Uniting Women in Cyber, and going to the conference. I've been to the conference, not this past year, but 2 years before that and last year. You were at the conference, I guess, probably my first year being at it sounds like you were there too. And last year they actually had a panel of people that were speaking, and they were speaking about cyber war. And I found a lot of those like points that they brought up being very interesting, and kind of will I think parallel into this pretty well. So like talking about like proxy wars, because like we are now seeing criminal actors that are, or criminal attackers, threat actors, being utilized by nation states like Russia or China or somebody, and that way that government kind of like has that safety net of being like, oh, it wasn't us, it was them. It was them. But they're not actually going after those like threat actors that are criminals. They're actually just utilizing them to help further their own. Do you think proxy wars are something that we're going to see more and more of as we have evolutionize into like more of a cyber war type of warfare?
That's a great question. I think yes, the answer is yes, especially under what I had mentioned about the way we engage in warfare in the United States. And, for the most part, we are still, superpower. And while there's other nation states trying to kind of change that hegemony at the moment, we still take the lead on a lot of the private, especially in the private sector, on a lot of the tech industries and all like our defense industry. And because I don't know, I joke and I say we're the mean girl that other people don't like, but because we're in the lead, there's not just our interests, but especially like our NATO allies, like people still look to us to help. And even companies like Microsoft or like Google that are based in the United States, these are US based companies. And we have really well government backed private companies. I mean, I can attest that the United States and Microsoft are completely different entities. But in countries like China, there's a little bit less of a distinction because you see the CEOs on the top of these companies oftentimes are on their board of these organizations, oftentimes are very well connected to the parties that are heads of like China, for example. And so there's this kind of mix between these organizations. And then when it comes to, and I'm sure you've seen this, when it comes to cyber attacks in particular, attribution will show that there's a lot of state-funded or state-backed hackers or state-backed entities that are, whether it's North Korea or Russia, usually tend to be the more common ones. When we kind of call them out on it, oftentimes they're just like, no, that's not us. And in the intelligence community, I didn't mention this in my bio, but I'm also a guest lecturer for an intelligence class. I just go in, but it's an intelligence class at Georgetown here in the DC area. And these students are from all over the world, not just in the United States, but very US focused. And one of the things I think is always interesting is when it comes from an intelligence perspective, there are things that you kind of can like point to and say with a certain degree of certainty, we know or are certain that a certain degree of certainty. We know that this is the case. I'm trying to figure out like how to say it without giving away our means and methods. So in that sense, I think we're going to continue seeing more proxy wars come up. Hopefully not, hopefully not in the traditional sense. And I say that like hopefully because I think it's going to be more robotics focused. It's going to be more cyber focused. And while today we don't really consider it like a traditional domain of warfare, this I think that AI, especially in quantum, is going to kind of enhance all of the traditional distinctions in warfare that we already have. And so when we're seeing what it's going to be like to, engage in warfare in the future, it's not going to be boots on the ground necessarily, unless it's very specific, precise action. I think it's going to be more so these kind of targeting and sanctions going back and forth, and just like an escalation of what's already happening. And I know there's a lot of questions that have been going on, especially with Taiwan and with policy as a large semiconductor supplier. With AI building, we need more semiconductors. And it's becoming like supply chain questions. And we've taken steps to protect our supply chain, but Taiwan is still a strong ally for us in that area. So one of the questions that I think has come up in the military space is, what would it look like if China engaged in, war with, to take Taiwan or to do that? They already have an overt posture that they could, because they see Taiwan as belonging to them. And I've heard different perspectives on it. I don't think it's going to be the way we typically see warfare or have seen it. And if it does, I think it's more so going to be in the kind of technology space. And here's the reason why. I'll just give you an example. I actually heard this from a really great speaker. He was like speaking, and I privately was like, "Hey, what do you think about China and Taiwan?" So because of the one-child policy that was prevalent in China for the last couple of years, a lot of our military leaders don't believe that China would engage in any traditional kind of boots on the ground, because it would be really difficult for their population, even though they have one of the, such a large military, to have like a huge generation loss. I think a lot of our analysis of what like a war with the United States would look like in that capacity, either way, even if they achieve their goals or don't achieve their goals, would end up killing an entire generation of young people in China, that they're just not willing to take that particular risk. So when I'm saying it's not going to be that traditional sense, is how can we still achieve our goal without having that same level of human loss? And I think it goes back even to that law question of what is war then? Because if I'm saying we're not going to get into traditional war, isn't war itself this overt action to exert force over another country or over another entity? So is it still a use of force if they do it in a non-traditional way? That's kind of it's not clear, because I don't know exactly.
I mean, if I'm looking at this from a cyber perspective, what you just defined could be a distributed denial of service attack or incident against a major infrastructure facility. And it's not an invasion, and it's not the launching of a physical weapon, but it is absolutely an aggressive show of force with a specific objective that is detrimental to an adversary. This is an interesting gray space.
An intelligence agency with a DOS, attack. If you're hitting them with a distributed denial service, and then it's an intelligence agency that they just don't have they don't have the ability to not have that data available to them at all times and all that. So you could have even more. And then what are you compromising as well? What now can be compromised once you compromise the availability?
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, if you take out the term incident and just replace it with attack, typically it really does fall into the definition of what traditional warfare definitions are, like a use of force to exert your will over a nation state, essentially.
Right.
And then there's different, iterations of that same definition. And I think we're careful because the US also has those capabilities. Sure. So it's sort of this almost diplomatic understanding that we call it incident. But yes, it would definitely fall into traditional. Has it been attempted? I'm sure it has.
Well, and you brought up nuclear weapons earlier, and we're kind of in that same kind of stalemate situation where a lot of these major geopolitical players have very similar capabilities, and everyone's kind of we won't blow up your network if you don't blow up our network. But that's where quantum comes into play. Suddenly, there's a whole new tool on the play, or a whole new toy on the playground, and there will be. Assuming that people don't have widespread quantum capabilities already, and obviously, Amanda, you mentioned earlier that more than likely, geopolitical actors do. But there will be a window of time where there will be actors that are willing to use quantum capabilities when other people don't have defenses for them. And that is going to be a fascinating, scary time. potentially, if we aren't prepared for it.
Absolutely. I also fear if non-state actors get a hold of those capabilities as well, because it's a little bit more difficult to engage in diplomatic resolution with non-state actors. Like if a terrorist organization got a hold of quantum capabilities and was, conducting a DDoS attack against an intelligence agency, it would be really difficult for us to, I think, try to negotiate, because their goals are very different from a nation's goal that has resources, and that you're kind of, is still susceptible to our, worldwide laws and different different regimes, versus like a terrorist organization that their goal is just to inflict terror, essentially. But yes, going back to the quantum capabilities, that is essentially how it's being viewed. That it is like equivalent to, especially the encryption, like post quantum cryptography, anything like our traditional RSA encryption methods. I think it's called QKD. Quantum key distribution is being used to try to develop and prepare us for how we would engage in more of a defensive encryption, engage in defense against decryption. So like this QKD is one of the methods being investigated to engage in that. But anything that's used from our traditional methods, I mean, they're kind of out the window. And you're talking credit card fraud is at an all-time high already. I mean, phishing. Now you're talking about AI being used, and a lot of these technologies, especially TikTok's just collecting data on people. A lot of that data that it's collecting, that these that's being collected. I've heard people are like, oh, why do you care about my dancing? I was like, it's not just collecting what you're doing, like on TikTok. It's collecting what apps you're on. It's able to build an entire personality profile and whether or not you'd be susceptible. If I want to try to phish you, I can have more of a targeted or which whale type phishing tool would be best to use on you, because I can actually use AI to determine where you're most susceptible, or whether or not you have investments or loans with certain people, or you have certain questionable behavior that I can blackmail you with. So information is gold in these spaces, and I really fear for what data is out there. Again, like I mentioned, even we've had so much actual data leaks in the last 5 years that every single time I even become apathetic, and I work in the space, I'm like, oh, another 1 million person data leak.
It's just 1 million people. No worries.
Just leave your credit locked.
But data is such a fascinating field, and I'm sorry to jump in, but the biggest threat to data is quantum, and is AI, and is this next wave. But it's also the biggest protection. There's no better way to manage data than with using safe AI and machine learning, because it's not tenable for humans to do. And you can secure and tag and sort and look at patterns and data at such an exponentially faster rate now that we can secure data so much better. So it's wild. I mean, this really is a double-bladed sword. Quantum will unlock a new capability to secure data and use data and leverage data security protection so much better than what we're doing now. But we have to be able to slide that into place immediately, or we're in hot water.
Yeah. So I do have a final question for you, and then we can go into our final takeaways. My final question would be, do you foresee, we talked about how cyber war kind of is going to pivot in the future, it pivots things. We're no longer in a kinetic war with when we were talking about China and Taiwan. Do you feel that like it could actually pull in a lot of our supply chain as becoming that's where we're going to hit you at as your supply chain, and then like that from there kind of trickles down? Is that what you see? Like, is the landscape of what we traditionally saw as soldier versus civilian going to change to being like, I mean, we're all kind of just soldiers now?
You're kind of going into my takeaway actually, which is that
Sorry.
we're all part
Perfect.
of this. But before I go into that, I think that is one of the quantum capabilities that I didn't delve too much into, but logistics and supply chain management is huge and resource management in the quantum space, because it has real time analysis. As Mac had mentioned, it's able to analyze the data in real time and give you strategic examples of where things are located, what decision you should make or could make, and different outcomes for those decisions. So with respect to that, absolutely, it's that double-edged sword, because now supply chains can also be targeted. What if that data is hacked? What if your supply chain, where that management tool that you're using also gets hacked, and they're able to see where all, your entire supply chain, where everything's located, and now they can target you in a more strategic way. So again, with every positive use, we see the exact opposite on the bad actor side, and protecting ourselves from those bad actors is going to be really key. And I do want to say, like, we tend to think of this in a very US centric way. And as a member of the US Air Force, like we're US citizens. Like, I am going to think of it in a US centric way. But at the same time, I do think that there's a lot of diversity and ideas coming from places outside of the United States. I know I have friends from the American Society of AI that go to Africa, and they're helping proliferate a lot of the AI tools in Africa. And the types of ideas that I'm seeing come out of different regions of that continent are like, amaze me. And I was like, no one would have came up with that, because we have access to internet all the time. So you don't really think about that. You just go to your local coffee shop, or sometimes like people are in different socioeconomic spaces, or have tools or ways of life that are just different from the way that we think and operate here in the United States, that we just don't think about in other places. So I just want to be cognizant of the fact that when we're thinking about those dual-edged swords, and that those capabilities, that international cooperation is incredibly important, because they're going to have perspectives that we don't have. And building those coalitions will not just help us understand where bad actors will come from. There's always going to be that tension, because everyone's going to want to be the top, with these big nation states. But at the same time, we really also need to defend against other bad actors and people targeting U.S. citizens and stealing our credit card information and stealing, breaking into our houses. As the Internet of Things becomes more prolific, you both, I think, understand fully how much things become more hackable at the same time. So even physical security is becoming just as important as information security or cybersecurity.
Yep, absolutely. Mac, any final questions before we go into?
No, I love that. I think there's so many layers to this. I love the idea of looking at non-traditional spaces for some of these new ideas. I was just, I forget where it was, but they were talking about the e-waste dumps in Ghana, and the exposure that the people there have to theoretically broken, but sometimes not broken tech, and the incredibly innovative things that are the physical technology innovations that are coming out of that space. Because people just have all these, tools at their disposal, and the creativity to use them in different ways, because they don't have the kind of, they're not privileged to have the resources that we have. And so they're thinking outside the box, which is really cool. And then, the Internet of Things, if it's got a microphone and you can talk to it, it can listen to you, which is very scary, but cool. But no, I think that's my last question. Is not question, but last comment is I think we're spot on.
I do have one final question for you before we go into our final takeaways. You mentioned coalitions, like is kind of going to be the future of like making sure that we get that diversity of thought. So like if somebody were to look at how do I go about becoming a part, like somebody wanted to help contribute to a coalition, like how would they go about doing that? Are there like organizations out there that they should look into? What would your recommendations be for that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it depends on your interests, because I have the students that I work with, like there's like student programs that exist that are more student focused, but there's the United Nations Association. I know that they're doing a lot of work in the AI space that I've been working with them. It's a local nonprofit that helps partner and kind of not just in the United States, but also with the United Nations and push a lot of those aspects of where we're coming from with our ideas and advocates for the United Nations over here, and the United Nations advocates for U.S. interests over there. So there's different, UWIC has different partners as well. So I think if you're in a big company, there's already probably organizations that you can just reach out to. I know that Microsoft has international coalitions that we already have and that we're working with, and there's entire teams that work with them. So sometimes I'll just reach out and ask them questions for fun because I'm like interested in what they're doing. And I'm sure if you're working at a big company or mid-tier company, they probably already doing a lot of that, only because of the global reach that your company will likely have, even if you're at a small business. And so again, I'm just speaking to the different types of listeners you may have here. So even if you're a small business, you're working, like, let's say I'm at a startup, I'm the CISO for my startup, right? I have ideas that I think would be helpful, but I think that these are something we should implement at the international level. You can put forward your ideas even to NIST. There's different organizations that are already working in the international space. The White House had a coalition that it was working in the international space and had people from, not just different nonprofits throughout the United States and big companies, but also international organizations working directly with them. And it was just this big sort of think tank. So I'd reach out to those types of organizations, think tanks, even academic institutions as well. So I just gave you a bunch of different scenarios, but just depending on your interest is really, you can just look and see. But I would start right at home. If you're in a college, if you're in a business, what do we have at the company? Ask your leaders, what do we have here that if I had ideas on making this an international standard, one thing we can propose, or reach out to me directly, and
Nice.
I'll work with. I'm on the board for the United Nations Association of DC, by the way, so that's why I was like advocating for them. I'll just keep dropping little nuggets for them as well.
Perfect.
Awesome.
Great organization.
We love giving organizations like that, a little bit of fire up in here. So final takeaways, go ahead. Mac or Amanda, either one, whichever one wants to go first. Final takeaways.
Amanda, please.
Okay. I did before this call look at just the stats for 2023, and of course human error tended to be the number one issue that we deal with in cyberspace. And you'd imagine on the military side, it's the same thing. Human error is typically how adversaries will get into systems, whether or not you're on the Fed side or on any side. So being the first line of defense is what's most important. And when we talk about quantum and all of that it's incredibly important. But our first line of defense is being educated ourselves and understanding what people are likely going to use to target us, making sure that we have strong passwords, making sure that we have an understanding of something that may come through that looks like it's from your CISO or from your CEO, and it's not that. So just second guessing and having those flags up is important, even if it's something that I know I like flag stuff anytime it's like Gmail and they're like, oh, actually that was our intern, he just used this Gmail, and I was like, well, he shouldn't. Like last week,
Poor intern.
Poor guy.
I was like, no, yeah. He's like, oh, I'm sorry. So just being diligent. I mean, human error. And I say that because I catch myself all the time, and I'm like, oh, like I need to, make sure I have multi-factor authentication on that, even at home, because you'd think that they wouldn't, like they'll use your private information to try to target you at work, or your work information to try to target you at home. So you have to think of it in both scenarios and the way that our adversary kind of attacks. And while quantum and future warfare is important, that piece of individuality and the role that we play as defenders of our communities is important for everyone. So that's my key takeaway: is just consider yourself and your role that you play as an individual.
Yeah, I love that. I love that you brought up like your personal threat landscape as well, and like your personal threat threat surface or attack surface, because when I first got into podcasting, I was working at an MSP and I was running a security operations center, and I was constantly like, I have to be awkward because there are certain things I don't want to disclose on accident, or like disclose something that could like somebody could ascertain information from what I said on the podcast. So I was like very, very nervous about saying certain things. But it was because of always constantly being like, I know that I'm targeted because I am the key that if I'm compromised, a lot of clients can become compromised. So keeping that in mind. Mac, your final takeaways.
I something that Amanda said is so fun. Like, if your CISO is asking for gift cards, it's not your CISO. Just know, if you take nothing else, if your CISO is asking for gift cards, it ain't your CISO. No, I mean, I'm going to take it back to our AI ML conversation. I think it's super important as we are looking at artificial intelligence and machine learning and looking ahead to quantum, that we are both being cautious and preparing our personal threat landscapes and our both our industry and our federal and our global landscapes, but also understand that these same threats also come partnered, and Amanda, you said this really well, partnered with incredible opportunity for benefits, and just being aware that these are tools, and they're tools that don't mean to be good or bad. They're just used, and we have to be very conscientious about how we are using the tools to ensure that we are using them responsibly in a way that is staying towards the good side. That's all I got. Natalie?
Yeah. Okay. So my final takeaway, I mean, I don't really have a lot of my final takeaway is mainly like, just because currently you might not be a target, like your company might be small or whatnot, you might not be a target currently, doesn't mean that you might not have a contract that could make you become a target. So just keeping that due diligence on your mind and making sure that like you're always reassessing that, because at any point in time you could get the right contract coming through, and now you have access to data, your company has access to data, and now you're the risk because you're the supply chain risk. So with that being said, we appreciate this conversation so much, Amanda. Thank you so much for joining us, and I'm sure we will have to have you on for another episode in the future. Next week, we will be back with Lloyd Evans, and we will be talking about engineering the future of GRC. So that will be our next episode next week. So see you all later.
Awesome. Thanks, Amanda.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.